Right, so maybe I should say a few words about the talk before I get into it. So first of all, this is the first time I presented this work. Happy to get any feedback whatsoever from you about what works, what doesn't, what I should say instead if you think what I'm saying is stupid. This, as was mentioned in the introduction, grows out of some work I've been doing for the last few years on the ethics of science communication. But for the last 6 months or so, I got interested in propaganda. And when I was kind of reading around some of the aspects of the history of propaganda, especially as it's understood in the US, I came to think there was an interesting argument to be made that a popular approach to science communication that I've been talking about in my previous work qualified as a kind of propaganda. And that is the... It's not working? Why is it not working? Is it because we need to click the screen again? No, it works, I think. Yes. So that leads into the main claim of today's talk. On the slide, highlighted in bold as the main claim. What I argue is that we should view a popular approach to science communication as a form of propaganda. So in a second, I'll say what that popular approach is and also what I mean by propaganda. But just two quick caveats before I start. So first of all, I'm focusing on science communication. So that is the bit where the scientist or a kind of specialist science communicator communicates the results of scientific research to the public. So public-facing science communication. That's different from science advising, which is when the scientist, or again, a kind of intermediary, communicates relevant scientific knowledge to a politician or a policymaker. And it's also different from scientific research. Right, so scientific research, that's what is being communicated in science communication. So my claim is about this popular approach to science communication, not science advising or scientific research. So the claim is not that we should view a kind of scientific research as a form of propaganda. Second caveat, I think what I mean by this will hopefully become clear in the course of the talk, but as I put it here, the kind of idea or the claim here is meant to be analytical rather than normative. What I mean by that, roughly, is that I think that it is helpful to understand this kind of approach to science communication as a kind of propaganda. That does not necessarily by itself lead to a kind of normative stance on that approach to science communication, because as I'll be arguing, one reason why we can view it, why we can view this approach as a kind of propaganda is that it is inextricably interlinked with the technocratic structure of modern Western democracies. So the question becomes what to do with that fact once we recognize it. So that's what I mean roughly by saying the claim is analytical, not normative. Okay, so what is the approach to science communication that I'm going to be claiming is a kind of propaganda? It is what I'm going to call the strategic approach to science communication. What is this? Well, I'm going to think of it as kind of combining two things. First of all, it's got a distinctive aim. And that aim is to secure broader public acceptance of scientific claims and theories. So for example, you are a climate science communicator. If you're following the strategic approach, what you want to do is you want to make people less skeptical of the science behind climate change, but also secure public support for the kinds of climate mitigation strategies that get recommended by kind of climate scientists in their public-facing sort of role. That's the distinctive aim. The second thing, there's a kind of distinctive method, which is the use of what I'm calling here evidence-based communication strategies. So that is, you do some psychology, some communication science, and you try and figure out which science communication strategies you think are most likely to serve this aim. So that is to secure broader public acceptance of the relevant scientific claims and theories. So you can find this approach in all sorts of parts of science communication. I'll talk about that later on. But kind of the resource that I'm basing a lot of this on is a handbook of what they call the science of science communication by these three people, Kathleen Jameson, Dan Gahan, and Dietram Schoffele, I forget. But Dan Gahan, he's kind of the most prominent of these figures in the literature. He's a very prominent Yale social scientist, and he kind of embodies what I'm calling the strategic approach to science communication. More details on how Kahan understands these things are to follow. Now, it's important that I make it clear that I am not claiming that kind of all kinds of science communication qualify as a form of propaganda. Importantly, if you look in the literature in science communication, you get this kind of distinction between the sort of approach to science communication that I'm focusing on and what I'm going to call kind of the engagement model, or rather engagement models of science communication. What the engagement models want to do is kind of quite literally just engage the public in the scientific process. That might mean something quite minimal, like just, I don't know, stimulate public curiosity in science, science education in that sense. It might mean something more involved, things like citizen science, the sorts of things that sociologists of science and some philosophers of science are very keen to emphasize. I'm not talking about that kind of model. I'm talking about this approach where you kind of view engagement with the public as a means to the end of securing broader public acceptance of scientific claims and theories. Whereas on this more engagement-based approach, in a certain sense, it's the engagement that is the point. You think that there should be more citizen involvement in science. What that means depends on the person, but there's a kind of clear contrast there, I think. Okay, that's science communication. Propaganda. So if anyone is familiar with the recent literature in analytic philosophy on propaganda, that's not what I mean by propaganda. As I'll explain in a few minutes, I'm thinking of propaganda in a way that grows out of looking at some kind of interesting developments in the understanding of propaganda, particularly in Western democracies, particularly in the US, through the 20th century. So for me, propaganda is, as a kind of general kind of way of defining it, a set of techniques for achieving social control. The reason why this is very general is that on the kind of account propaganda I'll be talking about, this is meant to be kind of neutral between the different ways in which social control might be achieved in different political regimes. So kind of roughly, in an authoritarian regime, the aim is going to be social control via domination, or at least some kind of coercive means. In democracies, as we'll see in a few minutes, the idea is that social control is to be achieved through the manufacturing of consensus, or the production of consensus. And the kind of crucial point is that if you're focusing on democratic propaganda, so that is propaganda in the service of manufacturing consensus, that can often quite centrally involve the provision of information. The crucial point, though, is that you're providing the information that you, as the, if you like, propagandist, thinks will lead not just to consensus, but the manufacturing of the particular consensus that you want to produce. So the names here are the names I'll be referring to when I get to propaganda itself: Edward Bernays, Walter Lippmann, and Jacques Ellul. There's a little note there about whether social control is the right word. That's probably best for the Q&A. I'll leave that for now. So here's the basic argument. As I've explained to you, what the strategic science communicator wants to do is they want to pick communication strategies that they think will secure broader public acceptance of basic scientific ideas and theories. Evidence-based strategies that they think will achieve this end. If you like, then the aim is precisely to manufacture consensus. And not just any old consensus, but a particular consensus, that is consensus on these basic scientific ideas and theories. And that is kind of in quick form the argument that this kind of approach to science communication counts as a form of propaganda. But as I said before, I'm not doing this simply in the service of arguing we should reject the strategic approach to science communication. Rather, I want to, first of all, better understand the role that it plays in democratic societies. So why is it seen as necessary to use these communication means that I'm claiming count as propagandistic? And if there's time at the end, I want to say something about what this might tell us about the prevalence and virulence of science skepticism, although that part is admittedly a bit too speculative for my liking. Okay, so here's the plan for the rest of the talk. I'm going to start with a kind of related but different concern people have had about this strategic approach. That is, that it's manipulative. I'll explain why that is different from my concern. I'll then talk about how I think propaganda works. I'll then kind of, in more detail, explain why I think that the strategic approach to science communication is a form of propaganda. And again, at this time, I'll say something about how all this bears on science skepticism. Okay, so the worry that isn't quite mine. So this is kind of the debate that I myself have been engaged in for the past few years. So a standard worry about the strategic approach to science communication is that it is manipulative. I've got some references there. I'll discuss one of them, McKenna, in a few minutes in more detail. What I want to do is I want to look at this worry because I think it kind of helps to differentiate what I want to do from what people who have this worry are concerned about. Also, it helps me explain in more detail what I mean by the strategic approach to science communication. So, like I said, I'm going to focus on McKenna, but these worries are more widely shared. So Gerken's target is a science communication strategy that he calls value-based reporting. And as he puts it, this means the science communicator is going to report a scientific hypothesis, for example, the hypothesis that human activity is causing climate change, in a manner that appeals to the social values of the intended recipients. So kind of targeting the message to fit with what you presume to be the values of your audience. So he talks about some of the strategies that the strategic science communicator recommends here. One of them is called identity affirmation. So that is roughly kind of crafting a message that kind of appeals to the cultural, social, political values of the recipient. So for example, if you're talking to a pro-business audience and you want to convince them of the need to do something about climate change, you're not going to talk about how it would be great to overthrow capitalism, wrong audience. Instead, you're going to talk about the opportunities this provides for technological innovation, basically making money. Another strategy is what is called pluralistic advocacy. So that is when you choose the spokesperson for your pro-science message that you think will appeal to your audience. So again, if it's the audience of business people, you might want to choose a business person to give that message. If you're kind of talking to a religious audience, perhaps someone that can kind of put the need to do something about climate change in kind of religious language, something of that sort. Or indeed, if you're talking to some anti-capitalists, you could put it in terms of how great a chance this is to overthrow capitalism. Same thing applies. So Dan Kahan, mentioned earlier, so he's kind of the big proponent of this approach. I've referenced an article he published in Nature back in 2010, kind of summarizing this, but he's got a lot of published work saying this in various different ways with respect to various different scientific issues. But his main focuses are kind of vaccine hesitancy and, as already mentioned, climate change and climate science. So the kind of idea behind his work is that he's writing very much for the US context. Climate change skepticism is, depending on how you interpret studies, fairly minority view in the US, but quite politically powerful. And in some studies, it can be made to look like more of a kind of widespread concern. And what he wants to do as a strategic science communicator is look at do some empirical science, try out different strategies, and look at the evidence as to which of these strategies is going to make the US public more pro-climate science, using the strategies I mentioned earlier, so identity affirmation and pluralistic advocacy. He recommends both of these strategies. So I'm not going to spend much time arguing for this, but hopefully the way I've set this up makes it clear that, like in some obvious sense, this is a manipulative approach to science communication. The way that I would put it is that taking this approach means treating your audience as, if you like, an object to be controlled. You're kind of treating your audience as a social scientist would, right? You're looking to design some inputs, so that is science communication messages, that delivered in the right way will produce the desired output. That is an increase in pro-science attitudes. And you often want to do this by exploiting the audience's presumed social values, identities, and so on. Using audience you think you have, using information you think you have about your audience. I mean, I'm not quite sure if I really want to put it this way, but one way of putting it is that borrowing P.F. Strawson's famous kind of idea of adopting the objective stance. So clearly, the strategic science communicator is adopting the objective stance towards their audience. So while I think there's a lot of interesting things that can be said about this worry, I'm not sure, or at least now I'm not sure, this is the best way to understand what's going on with value-based reporting or with the strategic approach to science communication more generally. First of all, maybe the more obvious problem, while I think it's clear there is manipulation here, there's a sense in which it's a kind of manipulation that is almost unavoidable in any form of mass communication. So how do you do mass communication without, in some sense, treating your audience as an object to be controlled? You can't relate to them in a one-on-one way because it's mass communication. It's inherent in the communication medium, if you like. The second problem, and I guess the one that I'm leaning more on here, is that if you frame your concern about the strategic approach in the language of manipulation, you are making what I take to be a kind of ethical point. You're essentially doing ethics. You're doing the ethics of science communication, if you like. What I think this misses is the political context in which the strategic approach operates. Why exactly it is that the strategic science communicator feels pressed to adopt this mode of communication that you might think is manipulative. And I think understanding it in the way I would understand it in terms of propaganda is a better way of doing that. Instead of framing it as an ethical problem, you're framing it more as a kind of political, maybe problem's not the right word, a kind of feature of the way in which we, or at least Western democratic countries, do problems. Okay, so that was the manipulation worry and why it's not quite what I want to say in this talk, although it's obviously related to it. Now for propaganda. So what I want to do is look at a few key 20th century figures in the kind of theory of propaganda, and from that extract an understanding of propaganda that the way I'm putting it in the slide here is kind of historically informed, but also I think kind of nicely captures what propaganda does even today, again, at least in Western democracies. So the kind of short version of this is that on this account, propaganda is a technology of governance. So technology here being used in the extended sense, where we can talk about like democracy as a technology of governance. So it's not like a gadget, it's a kind of way of doing communication that is adopted because it, you think, produces certain results. The slightly longer version, I'm focusing on kind of democratic propaganda. So the claim or the account says that propaganda is a set of techniques for securing social control via the manufacturing of consensus. So the control is achieved by getting people to all behave and believe behave in similar ways and believe similar things. So I think it's quite important, and actually a discussion with some colleagues last week helped me see this, that for propaganda, it's probably important that it's not just the production of consensus, it's the production of a consensus that would not exist other than via propaganda. So it's not a kind of simple influence, it's the creation of a reality that would not exist if the propagandist had not set out to create it, because consensus will not emerge organically, if you like. So the first figure is Walter Lippmann. Have people heard of Walter Lippmann? So American journalist, one of the leading journalists of his era, that's early 20th century, created the magazine The New Republic. He had various views about these matters. This is not kind of his only view, but this is the view he expounds in his book, Public Opinion. So I've got a quote from Lippmann. It's not the best quote from the book for my purposes, but it's one where he actually uses the word propaganda, which he doesn't always do, even though he's talking about it quite a lot. So Lippmann says, as a result of psychological research, coupled with the modern means of communication, the practice of democracy has turned a corner. He's writing in 1922. A revolution is taking place, infinitely more significant than any shifting of economic power. Under the impact of propaganda, not necessarily in the sinister meaning of the word alone, the old constants of our thinking have become variables. So the idea here, I take it, is that what propaganda can do is it can manipulate the variables of our thinking. What does that mean? Well, going back to the title of his book, which is Public Opinion, he thinks that the modern governor, the modern politician, can use propaganda to shape public opinion. Actually, not quite that, to create public opinion, because part of Lippmann's idea is that kind of pre-modern technology, it wasn't really possible to have such a thing as the public opinion. Whereas with the technologies of his day, radio, I guess is the name one, it was possible to have such a thing as public opinion, and propagandist was in the business of creating and shaping that. That's Lippmann. The second one is Edward Bernays. Anyone heard of Edward Bernays? He was Freud's nephew, which is kind of interesting when you look at his work. He was kind of founding figure in the field of advertising, PR, marketing, that kind of stuff. But he also had thoughts about the use of propaganda in politics. Frankly, maybe even quite terrifying thoughts. This is from a book called Propaganda, written in 1928. And he says this: in theory, every citizen makes his mind, well, it should be up, on public questions and matters of private conduct. In practice, if all men had to study for themselves the abstruse economic, political, and ethical data involved in every question, they would find it impossible to come to a conclusion about anything. We have voluntarily, you might question that, voluntarily, agreed to let an invisible government sift the data and high spot the outstanding issue, or issues perhaps, so that our field of choice shall be narrowed to practical proportions. I'm not quite sure what he means by high spotting, but the idea hopefully is clear. Propaganda is what does the sifting, or rather, you do the sifting as this invisible government or invisible governor, and then you kind of put out the sifted data, and that is your propaganda. But again, similar to Lippmann, the idea is that propaganda is this tool you can use to manipulate and shape public opinion. So in both Lippmann and Bernays, you have this, if you like, view of the problem of modern democratic governance, which is that people, well, in Bernays, people are stupid. In Lippmann, it's more that like it's very hard for them to kind of come to the same view of a matter. But it comes to the same thing because they think that there's a need for something that can shape public opinion to create consensus and convergence in place of dissensus and divergence. So for Lippmann, it's not so much kind of people are stupid. It's more, as I said, it's more that like he thinks that the challenge of forming an accurate view of the world is very difficult. Left to their own devices, any two individuals will come to radically different understandings of the world. And he thinks that's a problem for democracy, because you need to have a degree of consensus, kind of shared understanding of the problems and the facts and so on for democratic governance to be possible. And he recommends the use of propaganda, at least in this book, as a way of creating consensus, of manufacturing consensus. Just a little side note, I mean, especially when you read Bernays, it's fair to say there's the kind of incredible optimism in the power of social science that was quite common, I think, in the early 20th century. You know, this is kind of, to understand this, you have to think that for Bernays, social science was on the path of becoming a natural science, and there would be kind of sure laws of how to go about shaping public opinion. And we know that's not actually possible, or at least we've managed it yet. But I do think this idea that social science is kind of the best means we have of understanding people so that we can kind of push them in the right direction, that survives. And most prominently, I think, in the at least first decade of the 21st century, it survived in nudge theory, which has got kind of similar ambitions to Bernays, but much more modesty about what can be achieved with social science and scientific tools. But it's not hard to kind of view something like nudge theory as essentially, at least philosophically, doing the same thing as Bernays, albeit with more modesty than Bernays had. But Bernays, I think, had very little modesty. Okay, so that's Bernays and Lippmann, and they are very clearly talking about propaganda in America in the early 20th century. By extension, I guess, other countries like America, but they're not talking about propaganda in general, and clearly they don't have the history of the 20th century to refer to. I mean, they're talking before Nazi Germany, so they can't kind of have the kind of more informed account you would get from looking over 20th century propaganda. And that's what Jacques Ellul, a French social theorist, religious thinker, various weird things, that's what he does. So he's got a book called Propaganda, The Formation of Man's Attitudes, where he tries to give a kind of general account of propaganda, not just propaganda in America in the 20th century or early 20th century, propaganda as it was understood through the 20th century, and perhaps before as well. This is the definition. He says, propaganda is a set of methods employed by an organized group that wants to bring about the active or passive participation in its actions of a mass of individuals, psychologically unified through psychological manipulation and incorporated in an organization. This is a very broad definition. You might think it's kind of way too broad to be useful. And I'll kind of narrow it down to what you would say about democratic propaganda in a second. But first of all, why is it broad? Well, one reason why it's broad is that he is trying to give a definition that would cover both, for example, propaganda in Nazi Germany or Stalinist Russia, and what he would see as propaganda in the US in the 1960s. Obviously, that requires a kind of broadness because you're talking about very different things. And for him, the big difference is that America in the 1960s, propaganda there is trying to create consensus. Under Nazi Germany, that's not so much the aim. Soviet propagandists, Nazi propagandists didn't try to govern by producing consensus. But there was still this ambition to control the population. It was just achieved by rather more coercive means. But anyway, what would Ellul, or what can you kind of take from Ellul as an account of democratic propaganda? Well, something like this. First of all, it's a form of organized institutional communication. So he kind of mostly has governments in mind, but you could also think about large corporations. Second, that strategically selects and frames information to secure behavioral or attitudinal alignment in the population. So that means not just consensus in like belief, but also consensus in behavior. Where third, its effectiveness depends on the audience not fully recognizing or experiencing the selection and framing as manipulative. So you can think one of the interesting features of, say, American propaganda in the 1960s was that its subjects would not have viewed it as propaganda. They would have denied that. They would view propaganda as what happens in Soviet Russia, for example. But, to kind of get a flavor of what he means by this, so he would think of a state media institution like in the UK, the BBC, as producing this kind of propaganda, in that it's producing a kind of set of narratives that the public are kind of meant to take on board, understanding the major historical events and so on. And the same thing with a state education system, at least if it is in the business of creating national curricula. And also, something like institutional science, things like public health campaigns, all of which I think he would view as forms of democratic propaganda, because they have this aim captured in element 2 of the definition. So one thing that immediately, especially to a kind of philosopher, comes to mind is, well, isn't this just too broad an account of propaganda to be useful? Does this mean that everything's propaganda? Or is every kind of communication propaganda? That seems bad. Perhaps it'll come up in the Q&A, but just kind of quickly, 2 ways of trying to kind of restrict the account so that it remains broad, which it's meant to be, but isn't hopefully too broad. First of all, Ellul doesn't really do this, but I think you probably could, and this is going to go back to Lippmann and Bernays, focus on or restrict your definition to kind of quasi-governmental institutions, kind of institutions that are in the business of governing people. That might not just be governments, but centrally governments. And second, probably more importantly, it's important to understand that by securing behavioral and attitudinal alignment, he doesn't just mean influencing behavior. Right? Influencing behavior is quite easy. You just say something, people react. Right? That's influence. No, Ellul means something much more involved. And basically, it means producing alignment where it wouldn't exist absent propaganda. So as applied to democratic propaganda, that goes back to what I said earlier, where kind of the idea is to produce consensus where there would not otherwise be consensus. This is the last, no, not quite. Okay, so important points that I think need to be borne in mind. First of all, none of these authors is necessarily attacking propaganda or criticizing it. With Bernays, that's very obvious because he's an enthusiast for propaganda. He thinks it's great. He thinks we should do more of it. So Bernays quite clearly was not criticizing propaganda. He was, if you like, a propagandist for propaganda. So he's not criticizing it. Lippmann, a bit more ambivalence, but at least in this book, Public Opinion, he's clearly not criticizing the manufacturing of consent. He kind of views it as a kind of necessity. And Lewell's more interesting. He is deeply ambivalent about propaganda, but he agrees, I think, with Bernays and Lippmann that it's kind of essential to modern democratic governance. But he's kind of ambivalent about modernity, so it's hard to really know what to conclude from that. So he has the kind of skepticism about the modern world that you find in some thinkers. So he's definitely ambivalent about propaganda, but in some ways actually quite similar, at least to Lippmann, probably not to Bernays, who is, as I said, quite terrifying when you read him. What that means is kind of what I mean when I said that Illulian propaganda. This should be understood as an analytical category. It's certainly not a pejorative. He's not saying that we can view state media as propaganda and therefore we should get rid of state media. Rather, he thinks that in the modern world, state media is almost a necessity of modern democratic governance. Now, perhaps we should get rid of the whole thing and go back to pre-modernity. That's quite a claim, but he doesn't want to kind of make a simple dismissal of propaganda, partly because he thinks it's necessary, right? So what he's saying is that you need propaganda in a complex modern society. Okay, I'm running for time. I'll do this, okay. I just wanted to quickly say something about how this way of thinking about propaganda compares with the way in which, in the kind of recent analytic philosophy literature, people think about propaganda. So there's some people that have written some books about this, one of them quite a famous book, but I think actually the most influential account of propaganda in the recent analytic philosophy literature is this account from Cheryl Tuttle-Ross in a paper from 2002 or something, where she gives this definition of propaganda. So she says that propaganda is first, an epistemically defective message, second, that's used with the intention to persuade, third, a socially significant group of people, fourth, on behalf of a political institution, organization, or cause. Just quickly, this epistemically defective. That's meant to capture not just kind of false propaganda, but also propaganda that is kind of more subtly misleading. You know, selective use of facts, that kind of stuff. So it's not just falsity. So what she's trying to do is, she says, capture our pre-theoretic intuitions, first of all, with the extension of the concept propaganda. So that is, fit with our intuitions about what is and what is not propaganda. And second, she wants to capture the pejorative character propaganda. And that's captured, again, in one where it is, by definition, epistemically defective, misleading in some way. So hopefully it's clear that my account and Ross's account are not in any sense straightforward competitors. I don't need to reject their account. I could say, well, that's one thing you could mean, I mean something else. That's fine. I do think, though, it is worthwhile to say a few things about the comparison. First of all, the reason why I was talking about Bernays, Lippmann, and so on is that what I'm trying to do is articulate a historically influential understanding of propaganda. So Bernays is one of the earliest kind of theorists of propaganda, and he was a very successful propagandist himself, and his ideas about kind of what propaganda was for were quite historically influential. If you're interested, I can recommend a book about this. Second, on my account, propaganda is not simply about influencing beliefs. It's also about influencing behavior. Actually, in Ellul, you often get the sense that he thinks that influencing behavior is more important than influencing belief. The behavior comes first, and then the beliefs follow. There's a kind of interesting kind of psychological mechanisms you might use in order to explain this, right? So you believe in this, you behave in a certain way. There's a kind of requirement in you as a rational individual to construct a justification for that. Then the propaganda comes along as a useful justification for the way in which you've been kind of encultured into behaving. And third of all, it's quite clear from her definition that Ross is thinking about propaganda at the level of the individual propagandistic message, which was the definition of what it is for a bit of communication to be propagandistic. Whereas on my account, what kind of makes link propaganda is that there's the role it plays in a more kind of concerted communication effort, right? So it's not just that individual bits of propaganda have got qualities that make them propaganda. Rather, it's that the propagandist or the institution that is producing propaganda is trying to do something. Right? Again, they're trying to produce consensus or secure social control by other less friendly means. Okay, so that's propaganda. So this is the important part, why I think we can view this strategic approach to science communication as propaganda. So I'll do this and I'll save us time for science skepticism. So as I said, the strategic approach, that's just one approach to science communication. I'm not claiming this is the whole of science communication. There are these alternatives that want to talk about nice things like dialogue and engagement between scientists and public. That's fine. That said, the strategic approach, I think, is interesting for two reasons. First of all, it just seems to be very popular in areas of what you might call politically contested science. So climate science would be my example throughout, but obviously public health, communication and vaccinations and so on is another area where, as I said, Dan Kahan has done quite a lot of work. Second, I think in a certain sense, it is kind of the natural result of taking a scientific approach to science communication. At least that's the way in which the authors, or editors rather, of this handbook, The Science of Science Communication, put it. They kind of talk as if understanding science communication scientifically just means doing some studies on which methods work and then recommending the use of those studies in the context in which your evidence tells you they work. So yeah, I guess this kind of summarizes stuff that I've already said, but I guess I said it earlier in the context of Gherkin's discussion of value-based reporting. When you look at the literature in climate science communication, what you find is a kind of central organizing assumption, which is that the goal is to find ways of communicating climate science in ways that secure broader public acceptance of climate change as a real social and political problem. Well, first of all, as a problem, that is, it exists. Second of all, as a problem that humans are causing and therefore can do something to mitigate. And the strategies include the ones I mentioned earlier: identity affirmation, pluralistic advocacy. Another one that Kahan is quite keen on is narrative framing. So that is using narrative templates to frame a problem, to frame a scientific issue in ways you think will be congenial to the group that you are targeting. Where again, all these strategies are assessed for evidence of their persuasive effectiveness, particularly for target groups. You do some studies where you give your subjects messages and you kind of measure attitudes before and after, and you try and show that afterwards there is a significant shift in attitudes in the direction that you want. That is, they don't become more skeptical of climate science, they become less skeptical. This is annoying because this was meant to be a key part of my rhetorical argument. This was meant to be an image showing the titles of two articles that are much discussed in the literature on climate science communication. I can't remember the full titles because they are quite long, but one of them is words to the effect of communicating climate science in ways that make Republicans in the US less skeptical. And the other one is something like, I can't remember at all the actual words. So basically, it's the same kind of thing, right? So keying your strategy to the political identity of your target audience. And what both these articles are doing, in the case of the first one, what it's doing is it's saying there's this issue in the US where a certain political group are very skeptical of the science of climate change. Here is a strategy that you can use to make members of that group less skeptical, where that group is picked out as being of a particular political affiliation. Annoying the titles aren't there because the titles, as I said, play a valuable rhetorical role, propagandistic role, if you like, in my argument. Anyway. Yeah, so what I've got here is just Dan Kahan in his own words on how he understands this scientific or strategic approach to science communication. As he says, it is an empirical approach to defining and understanding audiences, designing messages, mapping communication landscapes, and evaluating the effectiveness of communication efforts. So again, aim is to increase public acceptance of basic scientific ideas and theories. And you do that by designing messages, mapping communication landscapes that you think will serve to achieve that aim. Okay, hopefully the way I've set this up makes it not that hard for me to argue that this kind of approach to science communication qualifies as a form of Illulian democratic propaganda, because these strategies are very much being recommended in the contemporary US, which I assume at least Kahan thinks is a democracy. So there's a kind of simple argument that I'll do in a second, where I just kind of take the features of Ellul's count and map them on to what the strategic science communicator is doing. And then there's a slightly more involved kind of theoretical analysis that I'll do afterwards. Okay, a little bit earlier, I had it that Illulian propaganda had these three components. First of all, it had to be a form of organized institutional communication. That seems easily met, because the kind of what the strategic science communicator is doing is they're saying, well, here are the strategies that kind of public-facing scientific institutions should be using to communicate the science, for example, around climate change. Second of all, it has to strategically select and frame information to secure behavioral or attitudinal alignment. Again, that's exactly what Kahan says you should be doing as a strategic science communicator. Third one, a bit more tricky, and I must admit I've not kind of got a nice argument here. Ellul says that the effectiveness must depend on the audience not recognizing the selection and framing as manipulative. I guess I'm just treating it as obvious that for any of the sorts of things that Kahan is interested in to work, the audience can't really be aware that this is what's going on. Right? So if you are a kind of conservative American and you are aware that someone is kind of choosing messages to give you that they think will make you change your mind, kind of seems plausible to me as a psychological matter, you will not react very well to that. At least I wouldn't react very well to becoming aware that I was the target of this kind of conscious manipulation. So that's the simple argument. The more involved one is kind of where I want to say something about the place that this kind of science communication plays in modern democratic societies and structures of governance. So we're going back to Lippmann here, right? So for Lippmann, there was this central problem for democracies, which is that they need consensus. As it applies with kind of the science is meant to inform public policy making, the problem becomes how to secure public support for the science behind technocratic policy making, right? So the idea is we've got climate scientists and they provide very valuable input into what we should do with the climate. Economists, the same thing for economic policy, and so on. But there's this issue where, again, we live in a democracy. The assumption is that there has to be broad public support for these things. Otherwise, there's a kind of crisis of democratic legitimacy. It's important here that public support doesn't just mean simple majority support. Right? That's kind of clear with things like vaccination campaigns, where just for them to actually work, simple majority support is not really enough, right? You need to have very high levels of vaccination for them for the vaccine to actually work. So public support here must mean something like widespread consensus. It's not enough if 51% of the population on any given day are pro doing something about climate science. You need much larger, much more long-term public support. So it's very different from, if you like, mobilizing enough people to win an election. So the problem for the kind of modern technocratic policymaker or politician is how to secure that widespread consensus for the science that is lying behind their technocratic policy making. And that, of course, is where the strategic approach to science communication can come in, because it provides tools that are designed to do exactly what is required to solve that problem. So you've got this body of scientific research that is trying to identify the communication techniques and strategies that you can use to increase public support for certain things and secure the consensus that you think is required for your technocratic policymaking to have democratic legitimacy. So that, though, essentially means that it is clearly a form of propaganda in the sense in which I am using the term. So these become technologies for securing widespread consensus, so that is attitudinal alignment, that wouldn't exist absent the activities of the strategic science community. So going to be something quickly on that. So the way that Kahan is approaching this is that there's kind of certain social and cultural forces that are driving climate change skepticism. His job as a science communicator is to work around those forces, find a way of doing messaging public that doesn't try and change the facts on the ground, so to speak, but kind of works with them and tries to secure the result that they want. So clearly he's trying to make consensus exist where it would not otherwise exist. So this kind of going back to what I said earlier about the manipulation worry. So it's not that I'm denying that there's manipulation going on here. Rather, what I want to say is that it's really no accident that the strategic approach is manipulative, because that is so by design. Indeed, it could only play the role it is tasked with playing if it were manipulative in these ways. So if you like, it's not a bug, it's a feature of the approach. Okay, how much time do I have? Do I have time for this? Yeah, okay, science skepticism. Like I said at the beginning, this is really quite tentative, and any feedback about what I'm doing here is very welcome. Just quickly, the terms science skepticism, science skeptic, they're used in many different ways. There's not a natural kind of science skepticism here to delineate. My view is just that, my definition is just that the science skeptic is someone who behaves in ways that manifest a lack of trust in relevant scientific claims and institutions. So they're not anti-science. Perhaps actually they're very pro-science in the sense of they are big believers in the scientific method. What they don't think is that existing scientific institutions, actual scientists, are living up to the scientific method. But they're not necessarily anti-science. That's important. And putting it in terms of lack of trust, I'm kind of viewing it as the lack of a pro-attitude. So it's sufficient, for example, to qualify as a science skeptic in this sense that you don't get yourself or your children vaccinated. So you're skeptical then about vaccinations. Perhaps you're not skeptical about other things. Maybe you believe in evolution, for example. But you're skeptical in the sense your behaviour manifests this lack of trust. So, I mean, it is natural to worry that the strategic approach is going to cause problems here, that it might increase rather than reduce science skepticism because of the risk of kind of backfire effects when it becomes clear this is what the science communicator is doing. So Michael Gerken, to mention him again, he raises this worry about value-based reporting. What he says, though, maybe is a bit odd. He says that the problem is that the value-based reporter is going to adopt different strategies for different audiences. So they'll put the point in different ways. And if the audience realizes they're doing that, that will lead to lack of trust in the science community because of the fact that they're kind of giving different messages to different audiences. I'm not sure if that's quite right. Presumably people are clever enough to recognize that, you know, the science communicator has got a job, and that job might mean saying different things on different occasions. I think the worry is probably more one of kind of transparency. That is, if the audience figures out that what the strategic science communicator is doing is kind of trying to kind of, I don't know, exploit their cultural values in order to achieve a certain result, that's going to lead to a loss of trust by itself, irrespective of whether they see the science communicator as saying different things on different occasions to different audiences. But anyway, that doesn't really matter that much. This worry exists, and it makes sense. So what do I want to add to this? Well, first of all, I want to add a distinction that you might think is important between the prevalence of science skepticism in a community and the virulence of science skepticism in that community. So prevalence, that is how many science skeptics there are, how widespread science skepticism is. But science skepticism, as I've defined it, can be held weakly in the sense that what it means is a lack of trust, right? It might not be strong enough to kind of lead to kind of positive distrust. It's enough that you don't have that trust. Virulence, that kind of means the strength of science skepticism, right? So a kind of virulent form of science skepticism would not just be kind of a lack of trust that manifests, for example, in not getting vaccinated. It would be kind of a stronger kind of skepticism that manifests in kind of, I don't know, protests, other forms of political action, and so on. So that kind of gives you two different worries that you might have. The first worry would be that the strategic approach will lead to an increase in the prevalence of science skepticism. That is, produce more skeptics. The second worry is different. It's that it will lead to an increase in the virulence of science skepticism. It'll produce more virulent science skeptics. But it might actually lead to an overall reduction in the number of science skeptics. Going back to what I was saying earlier, it's kind of important for the democratic legitimacy of technocratic policymaking that there's kind of widespread public support. So kind of the presence of a small but vocal minority of science skeptics imperils that, even if that group isn't that large, numerically speaking. So when I was writing this, I was thinking, well, look, if you look for data, it's not hard to find evidence that in the last 10 years or so, there's been a marked decrease in trust in scientific institutions, particularly in the US. And then there's some evidence of a recent kind of slight increase, but not back to the levels previously. But I can't really, with a straight face, claim that what's responsible for this is what I'm calling the strategic approach to science manipulation. I mean, you know, I could say something weaker, it's kind of one factor, it can't be discounted. That sounds fine, but like clearly it's not the main factor. There are all sorts of forces behind it, but probably most prominently, at least in the US, in this pandemic. That is probably the main cause of this marked recent decrease in trust. I want to make a kind of more complicated claim that probably is kind of hard to maintain, but I'll try it, which is that taking this decrease in trust for granted, we can expect the strategic approach to be less effective going forward. The strategic approach requires certain things to be in place, and with the kind of growth of science skepticism, perhaps only in this weak sense, those things are no longer in place. What do I mean by that? Well, this is going back to the way in which Ellul understands democratic propaganda. So he thinks that kind of in a way, the one bit of evidence for the superiority of democracy as a political system is that it requires this more sophisticated form. In a kind of more kind of anarchic, authoritarian system, propaganda to be effective has to be brutal. It can't be subtle, it can't be sophisticated, it's crude. It kind of forces you into submission, as it were. Whereas in democracies, it can be much more subtle. But for this to work, he thinks, you require a kind of background of high social trust and cohesion. So he thinks that kind of you've got this, however it arrived, society that is high in social trust and cohesion. And then the only challenge really is to get people in that society all thinking more or less the same things. But if you haven't got that kind of background cohesion, it's not going to work to try and get them all on the same page because they're distrustful in the first place. So this kind of leads to the following natural idea that when social trust and cohesion start to break down, when you see kind of clear decreases in trust in scientific institutions, old methods for securing social control, producing consensus, are no longer going to work. What you're going to see instead are strategies that, rather than trying to kind of create consensus, exploit divisions, right? So kind of trying to mobilize people that are already pro-science in favor of science against those who are viewed as anti-science. And you'll also see attempts to kind of create behavioral and attitudinal alignment via more coercive means, things like censorship, restrictions on media, that kind of thing. Now, I haven't really thought this through enough to make this claim, but I'm going to suggest that we could helpfully view the politicization of science, public health in particular, during the COVID-19 pandemic, at least in certain countries, in this context. I think it's kind of an obvious fact that, at least in the US, public health messaging was not a successful means of securing consensus on policies like lockdowns, masks, and school closures. If that was the ambition, it didn't work. And the result, and again, this is kind of obvious, was a country that was increasingly polarized about these measures and about the institutions that were recommending these measures. So it's kind of, I'm not quite sure what I should conclude from this, because what essentially I'm saying is that you had this old model where you could rely on kind of basic trust in scientific institutions, and the challenge was just to kind of get people believing certain things, behaving in certain ways. Now the new challenge is much bigger because there's not this trust in the institutions in the first place. And propaganda, at least in the kind of democratic mode, is just not designed to tackle that problem. What you do there, I don't know, but I think it's kind of one way in which increases in science skepticism cause problems for strategic science communication understood as a form of propaganda. So before I finish, just to kind of quickly try and summarize what I've been doing here. Hopefully it's clear what I meant when I said that the kind of claim is analytical, not normative. I want to understand this approach to science communication, not necessarily to evaluate or criticize it. And that's because on the analysis I've given, it's, if you like, this approach is kind of part and parcel of the technocratic structure of modern democratic societies. So rejecting the strategic approach kind of means, I say here rejecting technocracy, that's too strong. Rejecting technocracy as has been practiced in Western democracies in the 20th and 21st centuries. You would need something, a different way of doing it, perhaps. Final thought, this is the point with science skepticism. If you are very concerned with science skepticism, I wanted to suggest that it's hard to see how you could address science skepticism without starting to question the technocratic structure of modern democracies. So I'll finish with that. Thanks. Those are the references.
Okay, so thank you for your detailed and inspiring talk. And now we have some time for the discussion. So who have any question? Yeah, please.
Oh, sure. Sorry, should I record or stop the recording?
Yeah, it's still recorded.
Should I stop it or no?
Like this? Does it work? Yeah. Thank you. So you said that your analysis and your claims are analytical rather than normative. And I, of course, want to ask you a bit about the normative aspect. So basically, I wanted to know, do you have a stance on whether science communication seen that way as a strategical tool almost or process is ethical or acceptable? And I'm especially thinking of cases where the science that we are trying to communicate is not completely finished, as for example, in the case of COVID, where we need kind of to do something, but the science behind it is not yet completely done or proven. So do you have a position on that?
Okay, so maybe because you're giving that example, I can actually see something helpful here. There's a reason why I focus throughout on climate science rather than a more recent topical example. And it's precisely because I think that there's quite a lot of things that you can say about the failings of science communication during the COVID pandemic that just would not apply to climate science communication. And it's precisely, I think, what you're anticipating, which is that, that what is meant to give scientific knowledge its authoritative force and differentiate it from other modes of producing knowledge is that at the end of the process, you arrive at some kind of consensus, quite a high degree of consensus. Of course, there's still disagreement. It's not complete consensus. But kind of a scientific field is going well when it is producing consensus. And then when kind of consensus becomes impossible, perhaps you need to change things and start again. So there's this kind of clear contrast between climate science communication and public health communication during the pandemic, Where in the first case, what essentially people are trying to do is communicate what is kind of clearly consensus science, whereas during the pandemic, there was often an attempt to treat what was at best an emerging consensus as if it were a settled consensus. And that just doesn't work. And you can criticize that kind of on those grounds alone. So there's a kind of misrepresentation of the state of scientific understanding during the pandemic. And of course, then you can kind of talk about, well, why that was. And of course, the main reason is that there was a need to do something, right? So you can't just wait for the evidence to come in while you are in the position of having to say masks, yes or no, lockdowns, yes or no, school closures, less or no, yes or no, and so on. So obviously there's a debate you can have there, but there is this clear difference. And I kind of wanted to have an example where there wasn't that dimension of the problem. So that's why I focused on climate science communication. But you want me to say something more generally normative, I take it?
I guess I was, but I guess this already points to like a distinction between I mean, I guess we could have almost three cases. The first one is if you're trying to do science communication about fundamental physics, for example, but there is no action to be taken or anything. Another one is climate science that is less consensus driven maybe than climate, but still there's consensus. And the third one would be COVID, where then there's really the consensus is at best minimal, as you said, but probably there is no consensus yet or very little.
Yes, just quickly on something like communicating physics. I need to figure out the best way of distinguishing what I'm interested in from that. So I tried to do it under the rubric of this engagement model of science communication, where sort of one way of doing science communication is to say, you know, explaining, I don't know, quantum mechanics to an audience, for kind of trying to stimulate curiosity, right? So I'm not talking about that. I'm not saying there's any propaganda there. I think you're right. There's something else, which is sort of like, well, I don't know, press releases on recent advances in theoretical physics. I'm obviously not claiming that's propaganda. So really, my focus is on the kind of scientific research that can inform political decision-making and policy-making. And you can't really do that by discipline, because I'm sure you can think about like stuff that kind of belongs in physics that is of that sort. Perhaps I need to kind of add not just like inform policy-making, but like in some sense, politically contestable. There's a kind of category of politically contestable science. Again, this is all very difficult to do because you can't just do it at the level of like the scientific field. That doesn't work. But that's kind of the sort of way in which I want to distinguish what I'm interested in from that kind of example. So I'm interested in a way of communicating about politically contestable things.
Maybe a crude way of making a distinction could be that science communication in the case of pure science is maybe not propaganda, whereas in applied science it tends to be, it could be more generally characterized as, but not in every case.
It's too simple to work. Can you say more complicated? I need to figure out what exactly that is. But yeah, no, I'm definitely not talking about that. But this thing about singly normative. This is why I was so keen on emphasizing the way in which this kind of approach to science communication seems to be necessitated by a particular way of doing technocracy, where on the one hand, you want to hand over a certain degree of political decision-making to scientists. On the other hand, you want to make that at least minimally democratic. You want to kind of say, well, it's going to be a problem if technocrats are doing things that are completely at odds with what the public want them to do. So you're trying to kind of secure some sort of democratic legitimacy for what you're doing, for a process that isn't at all democratic. So what I want to say is that if that is your mode of governance, then I think there is probably exactly the right means towards, or that is the right way to do that mode of governance. It's no accident that you find this field of science communication, or this approach to it, that is doing precisely this. As for whether we shouldn't do that, I mean, I don't know. I feel that's too big a question to be addressed in a talk, in one paper. Really, what you need to do is to kind of have a more big picture look at technocracy as a form of governance, merits and demerits. I'm interested in doing that. I can't do it here. And because of that, I feel that all I can really produce is a kind of, if you like, conditional normative claim. Like, how you should feel about this approach to science communication depends on how you feel about technocracy in this vein. If you're against it, then yeah. But if you want to keep it, then I haven't here got an argument for not doing this kind of science communication. Actually, I've got an argument for doing it because it fits very nicely with what you're trying to do. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so next question will be from Martin Palachek.
Well, thank you for your provocative talk. I do have somehow follow-up question because it seems to me that there's a one problem. You spoke about climate change and climate science as an example of better consensus or higher consensus than the other. I mean, in this particular case, the communication with publics was backfired much more than we can admit. You know, there was a survey done by Helene and Milton, 2023.
So what's the name, sorry?
The Helene and Milton survey in the US, 2023, and because of the climate change has been falsely advertised as an end of the world as we know it. You know, the result was that 2/3 of Americans aged 16, between 16 and 25, those people believe that humanity is doomed, and 52% of people between 16 and 25 hesitate to have children because as a result of this. You know, the survey in Canada shows a similar examples, like 48% of Canadians between age between 16 and 25 believe in the same. So I think the problem is that that this idea pictures science as a basically good things, but we have many problems, and one of the most eminent problem is that we are prone to be blind to what Joseph Heath called highbrow misinformation. So there are many misinformation, and because they are aligned with many of us are progressive, so because it's aligned with our progressive view of the world, we are blind to this. So I'd be very, very cautious to generate anything that would be so-called like to inform politics for politics like that. You know, maybe it seems to be really, really problematic. Second question is, you said that we need to change behavior before belief. I do not see, you mentioned something, but I missed that. I do not see how could propaganda change behavior first, then belief. And my third question is, how would you consider, let's say, strategic communication of science in the situation we are living now, when sharing and producing information highly democratized? So there are the influence of information gatekeepers, like universities and everything, their influence is going down, and the influence of many sort of influencer YouTubers is going up. Young people, you know, I read also the, what is it, Reuters report where people between age 16 and 20, only 33% of them receive their information from traditional outlets. So they obviously are giving a preference to social media and etc. So thank you.
Okay, three things. Let me do the second one first. The suggestion that propaganda might shape behavior before belief. That was more of a throwaway line than anything else. It's in there because of something that was mentioned in the introduction. I'm currently part of a project that is trying to explain behavior other than in terms of belief. So I liked it that Elul has this view that furthers the aims of that project. Let me give you an example of what I had in mind. So the way in which vaccination programs work in the British NHS is that it's just structured so that you find yourself getting vaccinated. So you can get automatically booked appointments, then reminders to set appointments. If you take your kid to the doctor and they're due a vaccination, they offer you the vaccination on the spot. Vaccinations are provided in school, and you have to, well, actually, no, you have to give consent. It's not a matter of opting out. You have to give consent, but the school provides the forms and so on. I take it the kind of thinking here is that the best way to run a program of public vaccinations is not by trying to convince people of the virtues of public vaccinations, but rather by creating the expectation that you will have one. And then insofar as people have got views about the necessity of such things, they follow from the behavior rather than other way around. That's an example I have in mind, and it seems to be, I think, a good example of what Elul had in mind. Your first thing, highbrow misinformation. Good, yeah. So, I mean, what to say about this? I mean, I wanted to, I don't know. I think of this as making things harder for myself. So I am focusing on the climate science communication strategies recommended by all the researchers that have chapters in this handbook of the science of science communication. So, for example, Dan Kahan. Unless I've missed something, he is entirely focused on securing widespread acceptance of two claims. First of all, that climate change is real, and second of all, that humans are the main cause of it. So nothing that he is recommending would support the sort of science communication that would be responsible for highbrow misinformation. He's not recommending anything of that sort. I think it's probably quite easy to argue that whatever science communication is producing that is propaganda in my sense. But I guess I would almost regard that as kind of too easy. But certainly I would want to say it is propaganda. If you can point me towards, I don't know, serious academics that are actually consciously recommending such things, that would be excellent grist to my mill. But no, I wanted to kind of really focus in on the, in many ways, quite reasonable ambitions of someone like Dan Kahan. Third one, good, this is excellent. I think this this could possibly be a way of developing some of the thoughts towards the very end of the talk. I think it's quite clear, and this is no accident or surprise, that the way in which Elul is understanding democratic propaganda kind of requires this sort of centralized model for the dissemination of information. You've got the elite institutions that can have this gatekeeping function, and then they're kind of responsible for the information that gets out there. And obviously, we no longer live in that world. So one could argue on those grounds alone that propaganda in this sense is increasingly ineffective, and someone who has the ambitions of Bernays' invisible governor is going to have to adopt different means. So that to me seems like a natural development of what I was saying at the end of the talk. So actually, I like that point, and that's how I would be inclined to use it.
Okay, and Ladislav Koreň had a question. To the microphone, please.
I have not so deep question, just one question of qualification, and then one question for you. You mentioned that if I understood you correctly, that the function or purpose of authoritarian propaganda is not creation of broad consensus or manufacturing of consensus. But what then is the purpose or function of authoritarian propaganda? I mean, because as you define consensus, it look like it can be consensus. It can be consensus in belief, but it can be, and most maybe primarily, it is consensus or alignment of in behavior. And then it seems to me that it's easy to argue that even authoritarian propaganda, the purpose of it is, manufacturing kind of alignment in behavior, because what else could be the purpose of propaganda in authoritarian regimes? Or so that was the minor question. Then, and at the end of the lecture, you suggested that rejecting a strategic approach means rejecting technocratic structure of modern democracies. It seems to me that the idea is that given that we have the technocratic structure of modern democracy, the best strategy is the strategic approach we have. And then the question is, so what's your suggestion? So you seem to suggest that strategic approach is not efficient anymore, or at least in our context, or under the realistic conditions. And so do you tend to play with the idea of somehow criticizing this technocratic structure of modern societies? Or not?
Yeah, okay, well, let's quickly, are you finished?
Sorry,
yeah. First one, I mean, having less of a distinction would actually be nice for the paper, because as it is, I have to kind of create a distinction that I don't really need. And maybe thinking about the way in which Elul understands it, I think first of all, he's thinking of it. No, I think I will just drop that part. Maybe something here though about there's a difference between only looking for alignment in behavior and looking for alignment in behavior as a means to later alignment in belief or something like that. So for some modes of governance, perhaps you just don't care about alignment in attitude. You only care about alignment in behavior. It's enough that people obey. You don't really care why they obey. Whereas I think that Elul has this idea, and this goes back to Lippmann and Bernays, that kind of one thing that's interesting about the kind of democratic governance is that you actually do care about alignment in belief as well. But none of this is really essential to the main purposes of the paper, so I might just drop some of this.
I was just wondering what could be the purpose of authoritarian. It occurred to me that it could be, diminishing the dissent or over dissent. Or dissent translated into action. They are mostly interested in, bringing about some conformity, which is consistent with their ideology or something.
No, I mean, maybe as I said, I make a lot of the distinction, but then I don't actually use the distinction for anything because I'm interested in democratic propaganda. So if you don't think the distinction is really that big, there's no need to make it. So the second thing, the more important one. So there's a way of writing this paper that I don't think I'll pursue, but I think would work, which is that you've got this contrast between the strategic approach to science communication and these engagement models of science communication. And kind of one version of the engagement model kind of goes in the direction of things like citizen science. And that's obviously going in the direction of democratizing science. So bringing ordinary people into the scientific process in various different roles. And that is in effect to move away from a kind of simple technocratic structure where you hand over certain kinds of decisions to the experts and let them get on with it. So the whole thing can be understood as an argument against the strategic approach, for the engagement approach, allied with an argument against that kind of way of doing technocracy where you don't want to democratize certain scientific institutions, procedures, and processes. I don't really want to do it that way, but that's just stubbornness, perhaps. Part of the reason why I don't want to do it that way is that I guess I'm more generally interested in critiques of technocracy, critiques that are perhaps a bit more radical than that. So it doesn't seem to me that that kind of argument kind of gets to the sort of radical point I eventually want to get to, where this is a kind of wholesale critique of technocracy. But nothing I said in this talk supports that critique, and it requires a whole bunch of other work, which is why I don't really want to make many normative claims on the basis of this. I regard this as, if you like, necessary work before you can begin that kind of normative critique. But I guess I could make this easy for myself and restyle the paper as doing that thing I mentioned. But I probably won't.
And there is still some time for one last question, maybe. Okay.
So I'm curious, under what circumstances some sort of governmental information campaign is not going to be propaganda? It was not super obvious to me.
Can you say that again, sorry?
So when is a governmental information campaign not going to be propaganda? And the case I was thinking about was education. So it seems to be quasi-governmental. There's a lot of attempts to align people, for example, on how to use language and arithmetic and stuff like that. We try to frame things in certain ways in education to make it appealing to students with examples and stuff like that. And it seems that often students don't recognize that we do all this framing and strategies, especially when they're young. Like if you teach a 6-year-old arithmetic, it's not going to notice how we are trying to get it to accept arithmetic. So is education a form of propaganda is an applied version of that question.
So the honest answer is that I haven't fully decided how I want to do the, if you like, the normative part of the critique. So I've been focusing on kind of the relationship between science and public, and I want to use this argument that a prominent way of doing science communication is a form of propaganda as kind of part of working up to that critique. As applied to education, so I kind of think here, and this is why I like Alul, his point is that you should both recognize that something like a national curriculum serves what he views as a propagandistic function, and also recognize the sense in which that's a kind of important ingredient in holding a society together, right? So this is what I meant when I said that for him, propaganda is not a simple pejorative, right? There's all sorts of reasons why you might think it's a good thing to have a national curriculum, even though it's being understood as propaganda in a little sense. So I kind of agree with that. As for the utility of thinking of it as propaganda, but I guess, I don't know, I find that a useful way to think, because it nicely captures the way in which this form of governance works. Does that make sense? So, maybe one kind of narrower response to your question would be that kind of if you want to argue that education is a form of propaganda, right? So you're going to have to argue that in the sense that there's a kind of governmental attempt to frame information in certain kinds of ways, right? So there's a certain way of thinking about education. So certainly it wouldn't follow from this account that any kind of education is propaganda. It wouldn't follow that any way of having an education system is propaganda, because it might not have those kinds of ambitions. So for example, a model where teachers have got a large degree of individual autonomy, or schools even have got the autonomy to decide on their own curriculum, right? That kind of model, it's not obvious that education in that model would be propaganda in a little sense. It becomes propaganda when, for example, you have like a national parade. Does that help a little bit?
With the education part, yes, but so what are examples of things that the government can do where they give us information that are clearly not propaganda? Because it sounds like any sort of speech by any political leader is going to count.
Well, no. So this is why I emphasize a few points. For propaganda, it's not just the production of behavioral or actional alignment. It's the production of alignment that would not exist absent the propaganda, right? So go back to the example of climate science communication. The reason why someone like Dan Kahan is interested in this is that alignment on the existence of human-caused climate change is not arising organically. And not only is it not arising organically, given kind of a kind of cultural understanding of climate science skepticism, it will not arise organically. So there, as the strategic science communicator, you want to produce that alignment where it would not otherwise exist. So why is it that, for example, I don't know, telling people that about the science of black holes isn't propaganda? I'm going to need to add something to what I said, where it's not just that it wouldn't exist absent propaganda. Propaganda is not merely an enabling condition. It is kind of, in some sense, producing the result, right? So with providing information about black holes, the provision of the information is an enabling condition for producing attitudinal alignment. But that's the only role it plays, right? So that's kind of the key distinction. So a national curriculum where it will produce alignment naturally, so to speak, just via recognition of the kind of information provided, would be different for one where the purposes of the curriculum is to lead pupils to a particular understanding, for example, of a nation's history. So that's kind of the distinction I want. I feel like I've developed what I want to say quite a lot in response to your questions. So just kind of summarize, the basic response is that, first of all, I'm more focused on propaganda in science communication than education. If I want to think about education, probably I want to combine two things. First of all, a recognition that this is an argument that a certain kind of state education is propaganda. But second of all, an attempt to show that that doesn't mean that kind of any sort of state provision of information is propaganda. It's propaganda when it is designed to steer students in a particular direction of thought that would not occur naturally to them simply from understanding the relevant thing. Does that help? Good.
Also, we have come to the end of today's meeting. So thank you once again for your questions, and thank you, Dr. McKenna, for your answers and for your talk.